People often said madness came quietly, slipping into a man's mind like damp air through a cracked window, but the first time I laughed at pain was nothing quiet at all. It shattered something in the overseer's face, wiped away the smug certainty he carried like a badge. I saw confusion flicker in his eyes, followed by a sharp, startled fear he tried to disguise behind anger. That tiny fracture in his confidence told me more than he ever meant to reveal. My laughter had become a blade he didn't know how to block. It was the sound of a person who had wandered beyond the reach of his punishments, who had turned suffering into a private sanctuary he couldn't enter. They called me deranged for smiling through agony, but I knew differently. I wasn't broken, I was counting. Every strike, every insult, every hour of exhaustion carved another notch into a timeline he didn't know existed. My laughter was a warning he mistook for delirium. One day he would understand. One day, the very thing he believed kept him powerful would crumble because he never imagined that someone beneath his boot could think, plan, or wait with the patience of a man sharpening a secret weapon in his mind. My name is Jonah. Born in 1827, where the marshlands of the South Carolina Low Country swallowed everything in humidity and green shadows. Rice fields spread wider than the sky, pools of standing water glimmering under the sun like polished steel. Those fields were cruel masters themselves, breeding sickness, swallowing children, and breaking adults long before they reached old age. My mother, ironically named Patience, worked there from before dawn until the moon took her place in the sky. Her feet were always soaked, her skin always irritated by the filthy water, but she moved with a steady rhythm, humming songs older than the nation that claimed ownership over our bodies. Her voice carried traces of ancestors she had never met, songs from across the ocean that spoke of storms, triumph, mourning, and survival. I remember her leaning close, tapping my chest, then my forehead. "They can chain whatever they see," she whispered, "but they can't touch what you protect inside. Keep your mind sharp, and you'll outlive the cruelty around you." At the time, I thought she meant endurance. I didn't yet realize she was teaching me rebellion, quiet, invisible, forbidden rebellion. When I was 8, the master of that plantation died, and death brought a different kind of ruin. His estate was riddled with debt, so everything living and non-living was tallied and auctioned. My mother and I were itemized on separate lines of a ledger. On the day we were dragged into the Charleston market, I held her hand so tight that my knuckles burned, but numbers speak louder than love in such places. She was sold to a buyer inland, and I was purchased by a shipping merchant named Henderson. I screamed her name until my throat felt torn. But she kept singing even as we were forced apart, her voice floating above the chaos like a lifeline I wasn't allowed to grasp. It was the last thing I ever heard from her. Henderson's world was different from the fields. His warehouses crowded the Charleston docks, a place thick with shouting sailors, foreign languages, and the constant grind of commerce. The work was brutal, lifting barrels heavy enough to crush a man's back, hauling crates across uneven planks. But the docks were a school no plantation could match. Henderson believed literacy made workers more efficient, so he taught us basic reading and arithmetic, never considering that information given to the enslaved could become ammunition. By the time I reached 22, I knew how to read cargo manifests, interpret symbols and numbers, and decipher scribbled foreign notations. I devoured every newspaper or abandoned scrap of writing I could find. Learning became my secret nourishment, something no one could take from me. That hunger drew the attention of a Greek sailor named Demetrios Katsaros, a man with storm-weathered skin and stories tucked beneath every wrinkle. He supervised cargo from Mediterranean ships, and one day noticed me sounding out Greek letters on a manifest. "You see patterns most men miss," he said. "That is a dangerous gift." He meant it as a compliment. Over months of scattered visits, between voyages that took him everywhere from Cairo to Lisbon, he taught me more than any schoolroom could. He spoke of ancient cities swallowed by time, of sailors who believed fire could burn even when waves crashed over it, of scholars who guarded formulas like kings guarded gold. His lessons weren't formal. They came in fragments, bits of language, glimpses of history, scraps of scientific principles whispered when no overseer was close enough to hear. But the fragment that changed everything was the one he shared late one humid evening as we sat on barrels near his ship. "Not all fire needs air," he said, glancing around before lowering his voice. "Some burns because of what's inside it. The Byzantines made a weapon that terrified whole navies. They called it sea fire, flames that clung to wood, flesh, even water, impossible to quench." I thought he was telling a story like sailors often did, but he grew solemn. I have spent half my life trying to recreate it. Not perfectly. Too much knowledge was lost when Constantinople fell, but enough to understand the principles. He described pine resin collected in specific ways, sulfur taken from mineral springs, quicklime that reacted violently with moisture, and fats to hold the mixture together. He carried a battered notebook filled with sketches and formulas, though he never allowed me to hold it. Instead, he taught me to memorize. Knowledge is safer in your mind than in your hands, he warned. If you ever use what I'm showing you, the world must believe it was an accident or an act beyond human reach. Fire that laughs at water makes people think of curses, not chemistry. His ship sailed for the last time a year later. I heard he retired on a Greek island. He never knew his lessons would one day consume a plantation in flames that raged beneath a storm. I might have lived my entire life on those docks, gathering knowledge like a crow hoards shiny objects, if fate hadn't intervened. Henderson died suddenly in 1851, and his northern-born son wanted nothing to do with Charleston or the people his father owned. He sold everything, warehouses, equipment, and us. At 24, I found myself standing on an auction block again. I was purchased for $1,400 by an agent representing a tobacco planter named Malcolm Sterling. The journey northward took a week through cold winter roads, and though the traders kept us fed to protect their investment, the cold felt like punishment itself. Sterling Plantation dwarfed anything I had seen. 2,000 acres of orderly rows, drying barns tall as fortresses, and an overseer whose presence felt like a storm waiting to strike. Amos Miller, large, red-faced, with a voice that cracked like a whip even before he lifted one. He assessed me with the cold appraisal men used on livestock, sneering when he learned I could read. "No need for that here," he said. "Reading makes slaves think too much. Thinking causes trouble." He didn't know trouble had already taken root in my mind years earlier, taught by a Greek sailor with a dangerous curiosity. Miller believed the world made sense only if someone was suffering beneath his boots. He paraded through the tobacco rows with a whip coiled at his side like a pet snake, always ready to strike. The fields were different from the docks. No ships, no strangers, no glimpse of other worlds, just endless lines of plants and the grinding rhythm of work from sunrise to darkness. Tobacco demanded precision, transplanting seedlings without crushing roots, topping plants at the right time, harvesting leaves in careful order. Done poorly, the crop lost value. Done well, it made men like Sterling richer than kings. We were expected to work with the devotion of craftsmen and the obedience of tools. Miller kept everyone in line by inventing reasons to punish. A glance he didn't like, a moment of slower movement, a broken stalk. Any of it could become a crime. The others had mastered the art of invisibility, moving just fast enough, speaking just softly enough, blending into the landscape like shadows that worked. For a few weeks I tried to become one of those shadows. Daniel, an older man who'd survived 20 years on the plantation, coached me quietly. "You ain't on the docks anymore," he murmured as we worked. "Here, you don't want to be noticed for anything. Don't show you can think, don't show you can read. Just work steady and keep your head low." I listened. I tried. But Miller had the nose of a hound for anything that felt different. Being a newcomer was enough to draw his attention. Being literate, even if I hid it, made him suspicious. One early spring morning, I worked the seedbed, lifting fragile tobacco seedlings from crowded soil to plant them in wider rows. My hands were careful, but one stem snapped between my fingers. A single plant, one of thousands. I muttered an apology to the air, but someone else had seen it. "You!" Miller barked, his voice slicing across the field. "Get over here!" Every head dipped lower, every movement slowed as though the entire field flinched. He marched toward me with that lazy, dangerous stride of a man who enjoyed having an excuse. "Do you know how much money one plant is worth?" he demanded. I knew the answer didn't matter, but I forced out, "No, sir. I'm sorry. It was an accident." His hand flashed, striking my face with the back of his knuckles. The taste of iron flooded my mouth, and stars burst behind my eyes. "Carelessness is theft," he said. "Stealing from Master Sterling is the same as stealing from me." He grabbed my arm and hauled me to the whipping post that stood at the edge of the field like a monument to fear. The wood was polished smooth by countless backs pressed against it, dark stains in the dirt below testifying to old blood. He tore my shirt down and tied my wrists overhead, stretching my body until my toes barely touched the ground. 10 lashes, he announced, loud enough for everyone to hear, and he will count them, loud, so no one forgets what happens when you mishandle the crop. By the time he reached 8, or what might have been 8, I'd lost the exact count. The blows had lost their measured rhythm. He was no longer punishing, he was trying to erase that sound. The whip rose and fell with growing fury, but each strike only fed the strange certainty building in me. Every lash felt like another number in a long calculation, another tick on a secret clock he didn't know existed. My laughter grew clearer, not wild, not jubilant, but calm and eerie, as if I stood at a distance watching both of us from somewhere far away. Finally, he flung the strap aside, chest heaving, face gone from red to a blotchy purple. "Something's wrong with this one," he snarled to the watching field. "He ain't right in the head." He cut the bonds, and I dropped to my knees, mud and blood smearing together beneath me. Two men lifted me under the arms and dragged me back toward the quarters while work resumed, quieter, tighter, as if the whole plantation had heard something it didn't know how to name. In the dim light of the quarters, an older woman, everyone called Aunt Cecily, cleaned the torn skin on my back with careful hands. "You trying to die, boy?" she scolded softly. "Laughing while he beats you? That man doesn't need new ideas about how to hurt people." I winced as the cloth touched raw flesh. "I couldn't help it," I murmured. "It just came." That wasn't entirely true. The first laugh had been instinct, but the ones that followed were a choice. Felt like he thought he was breaking something that was already gone. And that was funny to me. Her eyes searched my face, worried and sharp. "You keep talking like that. Folks will say you're touched." She lowered her voice. "Whatever you're doing in that head of yours, be careful. Miller fears what he can't understand. A frightened man with power is worse than a cruel one." I didn't answer. But as I lay on my pallet, pain pulsing with every breath, I realized something important. Miller needed fear like lungs need air. If I refused to give it, if I handed him laughter instead, I turned his own weapon against him. My mind, my knowledge, my secret memories of fire that mocked water, those would be my shield. And one day, they would be his ruin. Miller's obsession with me grew like mold, quiet at first, then spreading everywhere. The other enslaved workers noticed long before he did. They'd glance at me with a mix of pity and distance, whispering that something in me was cracked. "Crazy Jonah," they called me, the man who laughed at pain. A reputation like that creates space around a person. Some were afraid I'd bring Miller's wrath near them, others believed madness was contagious. But being avoided suited me. Distance meant privacy. Privacy meant planning. Meanwhile, Miller kept testing me like a man shaking a locked box, desperate to hear what rattled inside. He ordered surprise inspections of my work, barked questions trying to catch me in contradictions, and punished even imagined offenses. Yet no matter what he did, no matter how much skin his whip claimed, I answered him with the same unnerving laugh. Each time I laughed, I watched that flicker of fear return. He was trying to solve me like a puzzle. The truth was simpler. I was no puzzle. I was a fuse waiting to be lit. While he fixated on breaking me, I focused on the materials around us. Sterling Plantation bordered pine forests so thick the trees seemed to stand shoulder to shoulder like soldiers. Their trunks bled resin, sticky and fragrant, perfect for binding fire into something that clung to anything it touched. I took small pieces on my walks, pretending to wipe sap from my hands after carrying firewood or repairing tools. No one questioned it. Resin was everywhere. The sulfur was harder. Early one morning, Daniel mentioned the sour smell coming from the marshy area east of the fields. "Spring water ain't right there," he said. "Burns your nose if you get too close." That description made my pulse jump. Sulfur springs. If I could find the source, I could gather what I needed without stealing from storerooms. On our rare half-day Sundays, when people scattered for a few hours of rest, prayer, or small errands, I quietly slipped into the woods. The air grew sharper as I approached the marsh, the smell unmistakable, like struck matches and rotting eggs. I knelt beside the mineral deposits, scraping yellow crusts into a pouch I'd sewn from scraps. Each handful felt like gathering another piece of the fire Demetrios had described. Quicklime proved surprisingly accessible. The plantation used it for soil treatment and for whitewashing buildings. Workers hauled sacks of it to various sheds, piling them carelessly in corners where dust collected. I never took enough to draw attention. A pinch here, a small scoop there, always taken while performing tasks where lime might reasonably spill. Tallow came through Aunt Cecily. She oversaw much of the kitchen work and often shared leftover scraps from meat preparation. She believed I was softening leather or treating cracked heels. I didn't correct her. With each ingredient secured in tiny, unremarkable amounts, I stored them in hiding places that no overseer would bother checking. The most important of these was a massive oak deep in the forest, hollowed years earlier by lightning. Inside its charred cavity, sheltered from rain and prying eyes, I began the work Demetrios had only hinted at. It was slow, painful trial and error. My first efforts crumbled to ash or smoked without flame. The next attempts burned but died when touched by water. I altered ratios, mixed by hand, waited hours in the dark with nothing but the smell of resin and sulfur for company. The night I succeeded is burned into my memory as clearly as the flame itself. I placed a small lump of mixture on a river stone and lit it with a splinter of wood. The flame sputtered, then bloomed into a fierce, sticky blaze. My breath caught. When I flicked water onto it from the river's edge, the flame shivered, then roared higher, feeding on the moisture, exactly as Demetrios had described. I stared at that impossible fire, heat warming my face, knowing this was more than chemistry. This was history resurrected. This was power hidden in pine forests and marsh springs. This was the weapon I'd been waiting for. But one flame wasn't enough. I needed dozens. I molded more of the mixture into small clay pots I shaped from riverbank mud. After firing them in discreet nighttime fires, each pot became a sealed container of destruction waiting to be unleashed. I memorized where each one was buried or hidden. I scattered them so that if anyone found one, it wouldn't expose the others. Over weeks, my secret arsenal grew. Meanwhile, Miller kept searching for a crack in me and never realized he was giving me more motivation with every strike. The enslaved community watched me with increasing caution. My laughter had shifted from strange to legendary. Children whispered stories that I couldn't feel pain. Some adults avoided me at night, fearing spirits clung to my shadow. Fear helped me, even if it stung. But not everyone kept their distance. One humid evening, Samuel, a tall, quiet field hand with a scar curling across his cheek, approached me by the quarters. "Jonah," he murmured, "I don't think you're crazy." That alone was enough to jolt me. "Why?" I asked. He studied me for a long moment. "Because madness makes men sloppy. You're not sloppy. You work steady. You watch everything. You remember too much." He hesitated, voice dropping. "What are you hiding?" I weighed my next breath carefully. Trust was a rare currency here, and one mistake could destroy everything. But I also knew that my plan required more hands than my own. "If I told you I was preparing something that could ruin Miller," I whispered, "would you want to know?" His jaw tightened. "Ruin him how?" "In a way he won't recover from," I said. "A way he'll never see coming. But if we fail, we'll die." Samuel nodded without hesitation. "We're dying anyway. Might as well choose the way." I brought him to the hollow oak that night. His eyes widened when he saw the small collection of sealed clay pots stacked in the darkness. "What is all this?" he breathed. I lit a tiny sample on a flat stone. The flame sprang to life, fierce even in the damp air. When I dipped my fingers in a cup of water and flicked droplets onto the blaze, Samuel jerked backward as the flame hissed and grew instead of dying. "Lord have mercy," he whispered. "How is that possible?" "Knowledge," I answered, "and patience." His next words were slow, reverent almost. "This could burn anything." "Anything," I confirmed. "Even in a storm, especially in a storm." He stared at the flame as though it were a living thing. "Who else do you trust?" "Not many," I admitted. "But we'll need help." Samuel nodded. "I know men who've lost enough under Miller to risk everything." Over the next weeks, he quietly brought James, Thomas, and Benjamin into the circle. Each man reacted the same way Samuel had: fear first, then awe, then grim determination. We planned by whispers in the dark, mapping which buildings would fall first, which would follow, and how to slip away unseen. When the fire came, it would look like an act of God. October crept in with a restlessness that settled into everyone's bones. By then, the tobacco barns were filled to their rafters with the year's harvest, dry leaves packed tight, brittle as paper, worth more than any single man's life in Miller's eyes. The air around the plantation felt tense, as if the land itself sensed what we were preparing. Every evening, clouds gathered over the horizon, heavy and dark, promising the kind of storm that bent trees and drowned footsteps. We waited for that promise to break open. While we worked, Miller prowled through the rows, whip in hand, unable to shake the unease my laughter had carved into him. He was unpredictable now, swinging between sudden fury and suspicious silence, like he feared every shadow. The others moved around him with exaggerated caution, but he kept his eyes on me. The more he watched, the more I laughed. Not constantly, not wildly, but with precise timing, just enough to pull at the frayed threads of his sanity. Each chuckle added fuel to the fire he didn't yet know I'd already built. He felt the countdown even if he couldn't see it, and the fear in him simmered like a pot about to boil. The storm we needed finally announced itself late one afternoon with a low, rolling growl that vibrated through the ground. Thick clouds stacked across the sky, darkening it until even the birds fell silent. Workers hurried to finish their last tasks as the wind picked up, carrying the metallic scent of rain and the promise of chaos. Miller's temper flared with the shifting weather. Storms made him nervous, and nervousness made him cruel. I was moving slower than usual, my ribs still aching from the beating he'd given me 2 weeks before when he spotted me. "You think the sky gives you permission to drag your feet?" he shouted. Before I could answer, he grabbed my collar and shoved me toward the whipping post. Everyone froze. The storm cracked open above us with the first drops of rain as he tied my wrists and stripped my shirt away. 20 lashes, he snarled. "And you're going to scream this time, Jonah. I'll rip that laugh out of your throat." The first strike burned hotter than the lightning splitting the horizon, but pain had become familiar, predictable, almost secondary, and when the second strike fell, laughter spilled out of me, low, deliberate, unmistakably amused. That laugh, clear even under the rising storm, shattered something in him. Miller swung harder, faster, his rhythm devolving into frantic blows meant to drown that sound, but I kept laughing, each breath a quiet declaration that he had already lost. The rain thickened, soaking both of us until water streamed down my back, mixing with blood. Lightning flashed, illuminating his face twisted with disbelief and rage. "Why won't you break?" he roared. I turned my head just enough to meet his eyes and let out a soft, knowing laugh. It wasn't defiance, it was prophecy. Even he felt it. The sense that he was striking a man who had already stepped beyond him, a man who had seen the end laid out like a map. He slashed at me until exhaustion overtook his fury. Finally, panting, soaked, trembling with rage, he cut the ropes and let me fall face first into the mud. "Lie there," he spat. "Let the storm drown you for all I care." He stormed off toward his house, unaware that he had just given the final signal, the beating we'd been waiting for. The sky opened fully then, rain hammering the earth. I lay there only long enough to count the distant town's bell tolling 8 times before pulling myself upright. The night had come. In the quarters, Samuel, James, Thomas, and Benjamin were already waiting, their clothes dark, their faces resolute. Rain drummed on the roof like a marching army. I stepped inside, water trailing behind me like a second shadow. "Tonight," I said simply. No stirring speech was needed. We had rehearsed every step in whispers. We reviewed our roles one final time. Samuel would plant the pots around Miller's house. Roof, foundation, porch beams. James and Thomas would take the tobacco barns, 2 each for the largest, 1 for the smaller one. Benjamin would target the equipment sheds and storage buildings, seeding chaos across the property. I would light the master fuse that connected the concealed pots, ensuring near simultaneous ignition. "Remember," I said, "no one must see us. When the fire starts, we act as surprised as everyone else. Let fear and confusion do the work." A collective breath filled the room. Then we moved into the storm, swallowed instantly by wind and darkness. Rain battered us so hard it stung like gravel. Visibility was barely 10 feet, a blessing. We slipped past buildings unnoticed, each man breaking off toward his target. I moved toward the overseer's house and took my position behind a water trough, far enough to claim innocence, close enough to watch. Through the sheet of rain, I saw lamplight flickering in Miller's window. His silhouette moved back and forth, restless, pacing like a man haunted by a laugh he couldn't silence. The storm raged overhead, thunder rolling so violently the ground shook. At exactly 9, the distant church bell tolled, soft through the storm, but clear to those listening. I reached into my coat and withdrew the master fuse, a length of cord, treated with the same mixture I had refined over months. It would burn fast, even in heavy rain. With a flint strike, the fuse erupted into a crawling ribbon of bright, hungry flame that shot across the ground toward the hidden network we had built. I turned and ran, rain slashing at my face, heart pounding in my ears. Behind me, the fire raced toward destiny. The first explosion of light was almost beautiful. A sphere of fire burst across Miller's rooftop, clinging to the shingles like molten honey. Instead of being smothered by the rain, the flames surged brighter, feeding on it, writhing in unnatural patterns that made the sky glow. Miller appeared at the door with a bucket, shouting orders lost in the storm. He hurled water upward. The flames roared higher, racing along the roofline, reflecting in his eyes with a horror that stopped him cold. Then the tobacco barns ignited almost simultaneously. 3 colossal structures erupted into towers of flame. Dried tobacco, packed tight and brittle, became instant fuel. Even from a distance, the heat felt like stepping too close to a forge. People poured from the quarters and smaller houses, shouting, panicking, forming bucket lines that only worsened the blaze. Water struck the Greek fire and made it dance, leaping from wall to roof to doorway, defying everything the world understood about flame. Cries rose. Some yelled lightning, others screamed curse, others simply stared, frozen by fear. And through the chaos, Miller turned slowly, locking eyes with me across the burning field. In that moment, drenched in rain and firelight, he finally understood the meaning of my laughter. The fire raged through the night like a living creature freed from centuries of sleep. Rain hammered the earth in relentless sheets, yet the flames only fed on it, rising higher, spreading faster, defying every rule the world trusted. People scrambled across the plantation in disbelief, their shouts swallowed by thunder. Overseers barked orders that dissolved into panic when they saw water failing to smother even a corner of the blaze. It was chaos wrapped in awe, an inferno dancing beneath a storm that should have drowned it. Smoke curled upward in twisting spirals, glowing orange where lightning illuminated it. The tobacco barns collapsed inward one by one, beams snapping like brittle bones. The equipment sheds vanished into a wall of heat, but the most riveting sight was Miller's house, burning from foundation to roof with an impossible ferocity. He stumbled toward it, soaked and frantic, shouting for help no one could give. Every splash of water turned into fuel. When our eyes met again across the swirling rain and firelight, something inside him broke entirely. He saw the truth, not the method, not the materials, but the meaning. Every laugh, every strike, every moment he thought he was in control, it all converged into a revelation that hollowed him out. The fire finally began to die only when nothing remained to devour. By dawn, the storm had dwindled to a soft drizzle, revealing a plantation transformed into ruins and steam. Smoke rose in slow, ghostly ribbons from the blackened foundations of the barns and the charred skeletons of smaller buildings. Miller stood alone amid the wreckage, soaked and shaking, staring at what used to be his domain. When Master Sterling arrived 3 days later, the devastation stripped the color from his face. He walked the grounds with stiff steps, recoiling at the destruction of a year's profit. The overseers tried to explain, each version more frantic than the last. Miller insisted the fire had burned stronger when rained upon, that water had only spread it, that something unnatural had occurred. Sterling stared at him as though he'd taken leave of his senses. "Fire doesn't burn on water, Amos," he said sharply. "You're inventing fantasies to cover incompetence." Miller pointed at me, voice cracking. "It was him, Jonah. He knew something. He brought this." Sterling shot him a glare so severe even I flinched. "You're blaming an enslaved man for supernatural fire," he snapped. "You sound unhinged." And just like that, the plantation's disaster became Miller's personal failure. Sterling dismissed him on the spot. "Pack your belongings and get off my property by sundown," he said, "and pray another landowner doesn't hear the foolish stories you're spreading." Miller's protest died in his throat as the realization set in. His reputation, his authority, his future, they had all burned with the barns. He stumbled away in numb silence, a man gutted by a truth he could never prove. He cast one final look toward me before he left. His eyes were red-rimmed and hollow, filled with equal parts hatred and terror. He knew, without understanding how, that I had engineered the downfall that he would spend the rest of his life trying to rationalize. But who would believe him? A fire that grew under rain was easier to attribute to divine wrath or unnatural weather than to the silent calculations of a man he had whipped and mocked. The plantation whispered about curses, about punishment from God, about storms that carried judgment. No one suspected chemistry crafted in secret or a mind that had quietly sharpened itself for years. I resumed work as if nothing had changed. The new overseer, Roberts, arrived soon after, milder, more cautious, superstitious enough to avoid cruelty. Fear had become its own overseer. Life improved, not by freedom, not by justice, but by the absence of a monster. Roberts didn't strike without reason. He spoke rather than shouted. He treated pain like a last resort rather than a sport. The enslaved community felt the difference instantly, and though slavery remained a cage, the bars pressed less tightly. Samuel, James, Thomas, Benjamin, and I never spoke openly of what we had done. Some truths were too powerful to name, but when our paths crossed, a glance was enough. A shared memory of fire blooming under rain, of fear shifting its direction, of a victory that history would never record properly. The months passed. Stories of the burning spread far beyond Sterling Plantation. Some swore lightning had struck in 3 places at once. Others whispered about omens. Children repeated tales of blue flames and ghostly lights. The truth dissolved into folklore, wrapped in exaggeration and mystery. No one ever discovered the buried caches of unused clay pots scattered in the woods. I left Sterling Plantation in 1855, when the master sold excess labor to reduce expenses. I carried no possessions, only knowledge, quiet, heavy, alive. I knew I would never create such fire again. Once was enough. Once had been everything. Years later, the Civil War tore apart the world that had shaped me. Emancipation arrived on paper before it truly reached many lives, but eventually freedom became something real enough to grasp. I made my way north, following rumors of opportunity, and settled in Ohio. I worked odd jobs, lived quietly, and never forgot the night the sky chose to side with the enslaved. I lived to be 65, long enough to see children born free, long enough to hear former masters lament the loss of a world built on bones. Sometimes people asked why I laughed the way I did, a low, measured sound rather than something joyful. They never knew its origins. My laughter had been forged in fire and cruelty. It had been my armor, my disguise, my countdown to justice. I never told anyone the full story. Not the sailors who taught me impossible science, not the men who stood beside me in the storm, not even the family I later built in freedom. But I carried the truth quietly, that a weapon once buried in ancient history had ignited once more in the hands of someone who refused to be broken. They called me mad for laughing at pain. But I wasn't mad. I was waiting. And when the moment came, the fire answered.